R.W. Cunningham, civilian. I'm presently residing in Van Nuys, and my hometown is Santa Monica, California. I've spent the last several years working in space sciences and doing research on an unmanned satellite. I consider this a natural culmination of my training and education and background. I don't believe there's any more challenging job facing man today than manned spaceflight. That's why I'm here.
I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to be an astronaut. That was 50 to 55 years ago, incidentally. But May 5th, 1961, I'll never forget it. I was driving from home out to the RAND Corporation, where I was working part-time as a physicist. And that was the morning of Alan Shepard's suborbital launch. And I'll never forget that when it got down to the last couple of minutes, I couldn't even drive anymore. I pulled my car over and parked it. I listened to 3, 2, 1, liftoff. And the next thing I knew is I heard somebody screaming, "You lucky son of a bitch." And I looked around to see who it was, but it was me doing the screaming. And that must have been the time that I made my decision to try to become an astronaut, because it was pretty selective in those days. And 2.5 years later, I was sharing an office with that same Alan B. Shepard, and it turned out to be a very critical, satisfying thing in my life. At the time, I was flying with reserve squadrons and going to college full-time. I was considered a civilian by NASA when I went to work for NASA. On the other hand, I think I was the second civilian in there, because Neil Armstrong was considered a civilian at that time, even though he'd had his military time. Well, when I was notified we got selected, and then we reported for a press conference, actually before we went to work. That was a couple months earlier, before we had to move down here and go to work. And the thing that I remember about that is I may have been the only one of those 14 that was selected that did not know any one of the others. I was considered a civilian. Rusty Schweikert was considered a civilian. He was not maintaining his reserve affiliation. And it was the first that NASA had done that. But I still consider myself a Marine Corps aviator. So when I ended up flying, it turns out I was maybe if they want to consider me that, I was the second civilian to fly, but I was also the second Marine to fly in orbit. We started our training, which really took most of 2 years to go through the various training aspects. And that was become familiarity with space, the programs, checking out the spacecraft, because we all ended up living, in those days, living with the spacecraft, because they were still under design. It was not like today where they report and fly the spacecraft that's there. So in order to get part of the time, and get any familiarity with that spacecraft, we worked with the contractors, helped install the equipment sometimes, did testing on it, critiquing it, tried to do changes. So we were growing as the spacecraft was growing. We were growing then. So it was a wonderful way to have good familiarity with the spacecraft at those days. After about 2 years, I think the first one of our group got selected, and several of them flew at the tail end of the Gemini program, which was, we had been there before the Gemini program had its first flight. But then the Apollo program was there, and I was very fortunate. I did get selected at the beginning of the Apollo program. Being assigned to the first mission, in our case, was especially unusual and rare, because while we flew the first mission, it was the third crew that we were on. And what had happened is just at the beginning of the Apollo crew assignments, and they were still flying the tail end of the Gemini program, But Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were on the first Apollo program, and so we started training behind Gus Grissom's crew. And in theory, if things got failed on Apollo 1 and Apollo 2, our crew would have flown the first mission. And lo and behold, after about 3 months, a little over 3 months, Gus, Ed, and Roger got killed in a fire on the pad. A weird, unusual kind of accident, but it enabled us then, probably 3 weeks later, we then inherited the first crew. And it was called Apollo 7 because of the way they just happened to be numbering those things. So that was our third crew assignment, and we were recovering from the fire, and we launched 21 months later, and I think we had made a little over 1,000 changes to the spacecraft. Most of them were not critical to fire prevention and those things. Some of those changes were, but because of the delay, we were able to get everything that we needed operationally done on the displays, the spacecraft, how we slept, how the couches worked, all those kind of things. So it was an amazing recovery in 21 months before we then flew the first Apollo mission, Apollo 7. Apollo 7 was very, very critical, very significant, because we were there to get the spacecraft, make sure that the spacecraft could keep 3 men alive in orbit, or most of them ended up going out to the moon, but in space, off the Earth's surface, of course. And our mission was laid out, was 11 days, testing everything you possibly could, and they expected a fair number of critiques and things that were bad that had to be done. Turns out it was an amazing mission. Most of the systems worked nearly perfect. It was 11 days. Most of the various tests were done, by the first week, and then there were fewer things towards the second week. So we got a little bit more time to concentrate on things for ourselves. But in retrospect, it's now 50 years later than the Apollo 7 mission, and Apollo 7 is still, to this day, is still the longest, the most ambitious, and the most significant and successful first test flight of any flying machine ever.
Apollo 7, Houston, how close are you now?
We're close to about 70 feet. It's tumbling rather wildly, so we're trying to stay away from it.
Roger, understand.
Ready to copy, Jack, go.
The public didn't have live contact with the crews. The public at large did not. And the public, even after that mission, their participation mostly was just being able to see the pictures that we took. But there were a lot of reasons why it was very, very difficult to get any photos. And we had like 500 and some frames. It was taking, in those days, we were using a real camera. It was a Hasselblad 500C, had an 80 millimeter lens. Since it was the first flight, we were worried about the film and lenses and what have you, and that was it. That was the complete thing. We were worried about the time they might set aside for all of that. And it turned out to be we got some very interesting pictures, and it was almost by accident because we had so little time and so little opportunity to even see the surface of the Earth, let alone take pictures. In taking those pictures, it was kind of interesting because whether we like it or not today, I ended up taking probably 60% of the pictures, and it was not my assignment. But with all the limitations and the restrictions we had and the problems that we had with our camera and what have you, I ended up taking quite a few pictures. In order to take those pictures, you had to have light. You had to have something interesting to take a picture of. You had to have the time to take a picture of it. And we were drifting around. So we were fortunate to, in most cases, to be able to take any pictures. But there were 2 times when we actually had an assignment on the pictures. The first one was after being in orbit. One time around there, we separated from the second stage of our rocket, the S-4B, and that was where the lunar module was going to be stored, and we didn't get a lunar module until the 3rd mission. But we had a target sitting there simulated so we could see what it would be like flying on that. We separated, we were flying around the S-4B. We then separated our orbits, re-rendezvoused the next day, and flew in on it. And so we were able, during those days, that particular time, we had an assigned pictures to document all of that. After a really fairly short time in orbit, we did start taking a couple pictures of the crew. Whoever had the camera in their hand might take a couple pictures. Actually, we didn't take a couple of pictures like they do today to see which ones. It was one picture because we weren't going to waste film on that. And to do that, you had to pick certain settings. We did pretty good inside the spacecraft on that. We've also gotten to the point where you can edit those pictures so nicely and turn them into good color, even if you messed it up a bit. But we did get some nice close-up pictures of all 3 of our crew members there. We were just taking pictures, and we were doing the best we could. And we thought we were taking good pictures. We had no idea how actually kind of poor the ones that we thought were good. The reason is we had film. It was not digital pictures in those days. So after we got back, we turned in our film, and a couple days later we got some pictures and we could take a look at it, and then we started seeing some of the wonderful opportunities that we did have, some of the wonderful scenes, particularly when we were flying on the S-4B right there at the beginning of it. Got some nice pictures of the ground. And there's some that we started looking forward to. If we happened to be pointed down, and if we had the film, and if we had the time, and if there was no clouds. I mean, there's all kinds of problems. But if we looked down and saw something interesting, we'd take the picture. The best pictures we had were those where we weren't paying attention to the background because we were busy flying on the S-4B. For example, coming across the ocean out here just south of Texas, and had a hurricane in there then. It was Hurricane Gladys, and it was moving over towards our launch site, and we had to make sure that it was far enough out in the Atlantic so that we could re-enter with that. So we photographed that. Actually, a couple times we photographed it when we weren't just on the S-4B. But it turned out to be some wonderful pictures. And Hurricane Gladys, my mother's name was Gladys, so I made sure I got some pictures of Hurricane Gladys. And so we were, as we're passing over Florida and taking the pictures of the S-4B, we got back, we saw there it was just above Cape Canaveral, and where we had been launched 3 hours earlier. It was our second time over it, and we hadn't even noticed that while we were taking the pictures. But when we got back, it turns out it was one of my favorite pictures. We were over the Himalayas and taking pictures there. I had one picture that I took that had the 11 tallest peaks in the world in that particular picture. When we got back, the ground didn't know any better, I guess, and they told me we had the 19 tallest peaks. They missed it a little bit. We also had some of the other kind of problems in taking pictures. We were warned before we flew, don't take any pictures of China. It had to do with all the politics that was going on those days. Passed over China a number of times, never took a picture. If we had wanted to take a picture, we could take a picture. We never looked down over China and saw anything but clouds. And So that was an easy one to comply by. But we had clouds over 55% of the surface regular. So if we had the right film, if we had the right setting, if it was daylight for those 30 minutes or 40 minutes that we had there, and if it was pointing down and if there was no cloud cover and it was something interesting, we could get a picture. I had another nice picture, and that was when we were getting ready for re-entry and deorbit. It was the eastern end of the Gulf of Mexico, and we were taking pictures. It was early morning, so the sun was low, and of course out to the east of us, and we took a picture there where you could see the sunshine coming down. There was Florida, and we're looking at where we were going to come home to. It's a very nice picture, and a little bit unusual. We had a couple of really nice pictures of Australia, and particularly, probably at least a week into the mission, we happened to be pointing down over the coast of Australia, and we were flying over the Great Barrier Reef. And we got a couple of good pictures of the Great Barrier Reef and that area of the coast on Australia. And you could look down and see we thought we were identifying some forest fires down there. Since there's some forest fires here over the Great Barrier Reef. Probably the biggest thing that we notice today is how many pictures they get, because back in those days, there were only 2 Apollo missions that stayed in Earth orbit, and the others all went to the moon. And you can't get very many interesting pictures of around our planet when you're on the way to the moon. You get no pictures of the moon while you're on your way there because you're busy oriented back this way, and the windows are back looking out at the Earth. The pictures themselves from Apollo, the Earth orbital pictures, Apollo 7 and Apollo 9, have some interesting pictures. I know that 9 seemed to have a little bit more difficulty getting good internal pictures on it, and they also got a lot of, several thousand good pictures of the surface of the moon. And that was a serious piece of the assignment when they set foot on the moon, because man had never been to the moon before. And today, that's still about as good as we have of the moon, because it's been 50 years ago almost, and haven't been back with manned flight yet, but that will probably be coming up. Now that we are 50 years later, what is the importance? What is the significance? I believe that what we did on Apollo was really a significant move in the history of our planet. And now we are basically exploiting some of what that was. But as we look back in our society, there are different times when we moved the boundaries out in our society. When we first, when man was trying to sail around the Earth, that was almost 500 years ago. And finally, we're successful in going around. It took them 3 years the first time, but they had basically pushed the frontier out and started opening up what man could be doing from that time on. The same thing occurred in the next frontier when we took man off of the planet, outside of the Earth's gravitational field, and out to the moon. And now the public talks about, going to Mars. Well, I personally believe that going to Mars is really a next frontier. Exploring the moon, which is orbiting around the Earth, is not the same as finally exploring the solar system and our set of planets that's in here. And I think it takes time to do that. It takes a commitment, and it takes a lot of money to do that. So we've got commercial people today. Some of them talk about going to land on Mars in 5 years, and relocate, hundreds of people and get society to survive when the Earth's destroyed, being on Mars. I don't think that's realistic. I think that we will have to get back to a realistic view of these things before we do it. And when they finally do that, there might be some individual, like Neil Armstrong was on the moon, some individual that would be the first one on a planet in our solar system. But that's going to be harder to justify, because the unmanned exploration of Mars has been really very, 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 very good. We had no unmanned exploration of the moon before we went there. So now you've got a lot of unmanned aspects of it, and you can probably get more information out of that than you could if man went out there and landed. But I think it'll be a number of decades before humans go out and land on Mars. We probably will go out and pass around Mars. We'll get kind of into our solar system here to do that. But as people become better informed, they're going to have a tougher time justifying putting a facility on Mars and trying to let humans live there.